Hi, this is Dr. Randy Bach. It's March 28th, 2023, and here with Michael Young. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to and who you are?
Hello, doctor. Thank you for having me on. It's really a great honor. I'm Michael Yon, not Young, Yon, Y-O-N, Yankee Oscar November. I grew up in Winter Haven, Florida, right in the middle of Florida, in a very lucky little town called Winter Haven. And I always thought I was going to be a physicist when I grew up, but I ended up went off to the Army, actually, became a Green Beret at 19 and went off and did all sorts of other things. And so at this point, I've spent more than half of my life overseas in about 90 different countries. I'm talking to you right now from northern Japan. I just got here about a week ago from Netherlands, actually. I was over in Netherlands covering the elections with the provincial elections in the Netherlands, which there's a reason I spend so much time in places like Panama and Netherlands and here in Japan. And it's all to do with CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and the World Economic Forum and this real actual war that we're in. It's mostly a soft war at this point that has very serious consequences. You can see world economy is collapsing. We're clearly setting conditions now for famine. Again, I'm in northern Japan right now. It's interesting how this place is kind of overrun with bears. I mean, actual bears. Like there's two different types of bears in Japan. And with a lot of the older farmers dying off now, they're abandoning they're abandoning, they're dying. So a lot of these little towns and whatnot and villages in Japan are now abandoned. And so bears are just everywhere, up in this northern part. And it's really wild. So they're putting up these robotic wolves to scare off the bears, and there's bear attacks, fatalities, and these are straight up dangerous bears. These aren't like black bears and Appalachians, you know what I mean? These are straight up killer Asian black bears and also brown bears, and they're nothing to be trifled with. Interestingly, there haven't been wolves in Japan, I think, in maybe 150 years, and likewise, it was similar in Netherlands. In Netherlands, again, I was just in Netherlands. There's real cause for me to go there. It's not random. I was spent several months in Netherlands last year, and it's because the Dutch, well, let's say the World Economic Forum, the Chinese Communist Party, are trying to create something called World Tri-State City. Tri-State City, Tri-State means three countries: Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. So those are the three states. They're trying to build this giant smart city called Tri-State City. And if you look up Tri-State City, I'll keep repeating it so you remember what I'm saying. Tri-State City. If you look it up, you'll see the maps online. It will comprise about 30 million people, and it includes um, Rotterdam and Antwerp ports, right? Those are the two biggest harbors in Europe, right? So they're massive. So those are, if you control that area, you're controlling a huge amount of the European economy. Now, interestingly, and not coincidentally, the railway that goes all the way from Shanghai and Chengdu and all these other places in China, they kind of feed together and they go right across Asia and dump out right there at Rotterdam. So it's not a coincidence that Tri State City is at the railhead of this Belt and Road Initiative that's going right across Asia. That's why I spend so much time there. But back to wolves. Interestingly, I just left the wolf thing in Netherlands, and when I got there, a wolf was killed about 500 meters from my hotel. Got hit by a car. Now, a few years ago in Netherlands, they passed a law that they proposed a law to protect wolves in Netherlands, and the Dutch are like, wolves? There's no wolves here, right? Why would you? Okay, pass the law. They didn't really argue about it. Well, anyway, the law's passed. The wolves are very strongly protected in Netherlands, and now suddenly they have a lot of wolves, mysteriously. And in fact, Ursula von der Leyen, what's her name? The EU, they call her the witch of the EU, actually. One of her ponies got killed by a wolf about 4 or 5 months ago,
Hmm.
and they got DNA off of her pony. They're hunting that wolf now. I don't know if they've gotten it yet, but maybe about 3 weeks ago, too, when I was over in Netherlands, next door in Germany, a young woman was riding her bicycle, and she said three wolves got after her. And luckily, it was an electric bike. She had a turbo button, she said, and the wolves almost got her. Anyway, these wolves. Why are they suddenly released in Netherlands? Well, it's quite clear, actually. It's not even hidden. If you look on the World Economic Forum website, they got this huge, you know, basically nature preserve with a bunch of wolves and bears, and all this was, these maps and these artistic renderings were done before the wolves even suddenly were on the scene in Germany and Netherlands. Right now, what they're doing now, the World Economic Forum, the left wing or the people that are globalists, let's say, they're trying to blame this on the farmers. They're saying, well, the reason that the wolves are killing all these sheep and killing the ponies and chasing the German girl down the road, that sort of thing, or because the farmers are encroaching on their land. Well, that's interesting to say when you're talking about Netherlands, which was underwater, you know, but the Dutch, of course, have reclaimed a large part of Netherlands from the sea. Of course, that doesn't get in the way of people of saying, but this is ancient, wolf country, which it was maybe wolf fish. I'm not sure, but anyway, it's really interesting. So I've been tracking the food and energy issues. I left Netherlands. I came straight to Japan, and I went to a place called Ishigaki Island. Ishigaki Island, if you look it up, is way out there in the middle of nowhere. It's maybe a couple hundred kilometers from Taiwan, actually, near the Senkaku Islands. The Senkaku Islands are contested between China and Taiwan and Japan, right? So there's a reason I went to Senkaku. Senkaku is like that forward edge of the battle area if we end up in a war over Taiwan, right? And for instance, a few days ago down in Ishigaki, the mayor said to us, they're quite concerned because, Japan itself doesn't have food security. They import 80 to 90% of their food for the whole of Japan. In places like Ishigaki, if you look at their caloric production, they might be 120% or something like that, but most of that is sugarcane, right? So their actual self-sufficiency is only like 10 or 15%. In other words, they just don't have enough food, period. If you discount sugarcane,
Hmm.
obviously people aren't going to live on sugarcane. And so what they're quite concerned about is that, in a war with Taiwan, first of all, they won't, or China, they won't have any food. Well, all of Japan could be very seriously short on food. And and what will happen? The people in Ishigaki will have to pull out because there's no food reserves there. I was talking with the mayor about that and other people. And so they'll probably be replaced, as the mayor said, with huge amounts of Taiwanese that'll come over on fishing boats, right? Including tons of mainlanders who will come over as spies or whatever and basically take Ishigaki Island, right?
Hmm.
So Ishigaki is in Okinawa Prefecture. So basically, you would be, let's say, the state of Okinawa, right? And of course, there's other islands in that prefecture, but the bottom line is, any war causes this human osmotic pressure, that push and pull of migration. But so I've been over here, last night spent or yesterday and late into the night with a bunch of Japanese government officials, military, their intelligence people, elected officials, and whatnot, talking a lot about food and energy and migration issues, right? Which they're quite concerned about because everybody most of the people that are paying attention at least can see that we've got some problems building in the world. A lot of people can see that conditions are building for severe famines, right? Now, how will those famines play out? Unknown to me. That's actually why I'm in northern Japan, because I'm studying the food issues, right? I was just down in Ishigaki, which is about as south as you can get in Japan. It's near Taiwan. And now I'm up near the north. And, the reason why I'm going all over is to do things like talk with farmers. But a problem with the farmers in Japan is most of them are about 70 or more years old, right?
Yeah.
So they're dying off literally every day. There's just zero food security for Japan. So Japan is very easily cut off with food and energy. This is a
Okay, so
big deal, obviously.
speaking of cut off, I'm gonna cut you off just for a second. So this is fascinating groundwork. Um, so I'm just gonna kind of probe a little bit deeper on a couple of things you say. Whether you say one, there are trends towards potential famine. Number two, you're talking mentioning the PRC versus Taiwan. I'd like to kind of touch on that, and not to confuse things, but in regard to, weirdly enough, our involvement in Ukraine. Whether we are, from a military sense, overcommitting ourselves, and whether we're in fact undercommitting, our World War II opponents, Germany and Japan, now our allies, and whether they have the wherewithal to self-defend. You were mentioning, you've kind of got, talked about the Tri-City state, which it involves Germany, and now Japan, in regard to, say, potential war in Taiwan. Now, the Taiwan, I want to give a shout out to my son, Sam Bach, and his friend Michael Williamson and Andrew Denary, who have a show called the Pravdcast, like Pravda cast, like pun on podcast, as well as the Synopsis, Sinopsis. So they've been doing geopolitics now for a number of years on this great podcast series of both of them. And so I've been listening assiduously to the podcast, and they talk about, well, Michael's kind of more of a gearhead, artillery deep dive, and he understands that there's not that much overlap between the armaments that we're sending to Ukraine and then potentially what we might be sending to Taiwan in a hot war. But Sam is much more cautious about this and saying, well, we've depleted a lot of our armaments, locally in the U.S., and we were kind of like 7 years. He used up 7 years worth of, I forget which one, javelins or something like that. I'm not sure whether we can recoup them immediately. A lot of our manufacturing is not like it was in World War II, where we had everything, domestically and whatnot. So to kind of hone in on the question, his point is about Taiwan, that it's a very different thing. It's not necessarily going to be a hot war all of a sudden. It could just be an encirclement. And by the time that China decides to encircle Taiwan, and speaking of food and all that kind of stuff, it could be a war of attrition or just kind of a Berlin airlift scenario. So here's to kind of get to the question, I guess. So you're in Japan. Have you got any sensibility? The Japanese are kind of more interested in self-protection, or are they just going to go with the flow, where they're relying on big, daddy U.S. to do this, and is Big Daddy a little bit overextended by paying for this gal, for that gal, and so forth? He can't really, deal with all his, baby mamas, if you will, all the people that are somewhat dependent on him. So see if you can unbundle any of that. That's your puzzle box.
Well, you can see the U.S. economy is collapsing. You can see the United States internally is at risk of going to civil war. I mean, so this idea that we're going to keep running off and doing these massive wars, our strategic oil supply is greatly reduced at this point. I mean, we're just not in the condition to do any large hot war. Of course, China doesn't have to just invade Taiwan. I think China doesn't actually want to do that, and they're very clear about that they would, but they don't want to do it. They want to just take it. They just want to swallow it slowly, like they did to Hong Kong. I was in Hong Kong when they did that. I was there for that last 7 months before they kicked me out. In fact, if you web search my name, Michael Yan, in Hong Kong, you'll see the Hong Kong police escorting me to an airplane and kicking me out. So I was there watching them swallow that, basically Chinese Communist Party. One of the mechanisms that they used to take Hong Kong was by just weaponized migration. So just every day, day in and day out, they brought about 100 to 150 mainlanders in, Mandarin-speaking mainland Chinese, into Hong Kong. They did this for year after year. They took over the school boards. They took over the schools, the curriculum. Of course, they're pushing the speaking of Mandarin instead of Cantonese. In Hong Kong, the predominant language is Cantonese. They're different people. They don't even look the same. Now, for a lot of people who don't spend much time in Asia, they might all look the same, but they don't look the same to me, and they don't look the same to each other. They're different people. They don't even speak the same language. Cantonese and Mandarin are just different languages, right? And so when the mainlanders are coming over to take over Hong Kong, one of the things that they're doing is enforcing that people speak Mandarin only, right? It's very upsetting if you look at anybody that you don't want to be dominated by as an American, for Hong Kongers, that would be mainland Chinese, Mandarin speaking Chinese, right? Interestingly, when I recently went down to the Darien Gap in Panama, I go there quite often. I'm going back in about a week because the Darien Gap is a place where there's huge migration coming through, including a lot of mainland Chinese. I took 2 Chinese with me. I took one who spoke Cantonese and one who spoke Mandarin, right? And I took them down there just to interview Chinese who were coming through the Darien Gap. And none of the Chinese that are coming through Darien Gap None of them spoke Cantonese. They all spoke, of the about 50 that we encountered uh, during the couple days that we were doing those interviews. They all spoke Mandarin, and they're from all over the place in China. By the way, they weren't Malaysian, they weren't, Indonesian, they weren't Thai Chais from, Chinese from Thailand, they weren't Chinese from Taiwan. They were mainland Chinese. They were from places like Shanghai, Chengdu, Xi'an, and so many places, Beijing, all over the place. And they were professionals mostly. These weren't like poor people. These were like, some of them seemed military to me. There were some family units, but they were mostly military age males. Most of them told me that they paid about $20,000 to get there, and they pay another 10,000 from Panama up to usually Texas is where they cross. So that's about $30,000. So they'll leave mainland China, they'll fly to Ecuador, and from Ecuador they'll take a bus up to Panama, and they'll go to a place called Nicocli, which I've done before. Not taking the bus from Ecuador, but I've been to Nicocli in Colombia, and they get on boats and they go to another place in Colombia called Copacabana. And from there, the Chinese will pay to take another boat, and they end up in the Panamanian jungle. And long story short, they end up all over the United States. So who is sponsoring all these Chinese to come to the United States? It's not just Chinese. In February, we had at least 150,000 people that we know of illegally cross the border into the United States. 1 month, February, about 150,000, right? That's a defensible number. The number actually seems to be significantly higher, but I'm safe to say 150,000 just in February, right? We're being invaded. It's the same with Europe, right? I've been all over Europe. I lived in Europe. I've been in the last 2 years, I've probably spent 6 months or more in Europe, all over the place, watching the migration, watching the flows, watching the weaponized migration. For instance, I was down in Morocco and Africa with Chuck Holton, and we saw that Belarus was pumping migrants, trying to pump them into Poland. Poland resisted, and Lithuania, right? So we flew up to Lithuania. I had been in Afghanistan with the Lithuanian army, so I have good contacts there. And I called up and said, "Hey, what's going on? Why is Belarus pumping migrants into Lithuania, and why are you letting them in?" And so anyway, flew straight up to Vilnius and went straight into meetings. I spent a month there, actually. They gave me full access to the camps. And that was when I started warning that Russia is up to something, possibly with Ukraine. And anyway, so I was publishing about that at the time. And now we see there's been the war and that sort of thing. But the weaponized migration has been a tool since forever, right? It's been done both internally and externally. For instance, in the Soviet Union, Stalin did it to Ukraine in the 20s and 30s. For instance, with the Holodomor famine in 1932-33, it was a replacement strategy to replace the kulak farmers, right? So the farmers were replaced with migrants, internal migrants. Basically, the information war revolved around demonizing the kulaks, labeling first of all, demonizing the term kulak, right? Kulak is a bad thing, making it, just like labeling Jews, just like labeling Polish. And like with the Poles had to wear the P, the Jews had to wear the Star of David. And with the kulaks, it was very similar. So first you make the term very unpalatable, and then you hang that around people's neck and say, well, that guy's a kulak. And the reason that your food prices are high, the reason you're having so many problems is because the kulaks are getting rich off of you. Otherwise, you would be in a much better. Go ahead,
for
sir.
our audience, the definition. I mean, minor difference is that the kulaks were a kind of a class. The Poles and the Jews and so forth, Gypsies, whatever, they were ethnicities in a sense, and so they were tied by language and blood. Whereas the kulaks were a class of people who were basically doing the farming, and so it's kind of like getting rid of computer programmers or whatever group you decide to demonize. So it was a class demonization. I'm just minor point. And so once they labeled them, they became the problem. And these are the guys who are like bringing your food. There are some echoes from the World Economic Forum and probably in the Netherlands as well, where nowadays we are in a sense demonizing our food producing class. In the Netherlands, there's
100%.
all these rules to, that they have to stop using fertilizer and stop doing this, give back to the wolves. I think that giving back to the wolves is an incredible metaphor for what we're doing worldwide, whether the wolves are these, kind of our ignoring being overrun, which, by the way, is the name of a great book out. I was listening to an interview on the Andrew Klavan show, and the book is Overrun, about how our southern border is just being overrun. We have literally an order of magnitude more people coming in, and just as a kind of side note, people are saying, oh well, Trump didn't build a wall, he didn't finish the wall, he didn't care about it either, he broke his promise, but he actually brought migration down, by fivefold, and since then it's gone up by more than tenfold at least. And as you point out, a lot of people just think it's kind of poor Hondurans or Nicaraguans, whatever, kind of traipsing across, but it's a huge funnel or gateway for people from Africa and China and wherever. I mean, basically everybody has the message. People wind up here and they send selfies back to whatever village, wherever on earth. It's easy to do, and people are coming. Pretty much, we have border controls at our airports, but why? Because we have a huge border that we don't control at all. So if you're Mata Hari or some kind of like spy versus spy, why bother showing up in New York or Los Angeles airports? You just kind of traipse across whichever pass. And the Darien Pass is an interesting thing because it's jungle, and I just want to point out to the audience, your kind of incredible bravery, your peripatetic bravery in showing up in all these places. And this is your long history that you've had. I first became familiar with your work, and I believe, I think it was Afghanistan, but later more so in Iraq. Anyway, I'm going to, you're probably the bravest reporter out there. You literally embed with the troops, have been embedded with the troops. I want to misstate that. Anyway, so I apologize for losing your stream a little bit, but it seems to me that we are all, metaphorically and actually, whether it's real or not, giving ourselves over to wolves. And why is this, part of the World Economic Forum agenda, if in fact they care about the economic part of our world? It seems to me that as if in everything, we spent a lot of time in the before times up to 2019 building everything up, and ever since then we've been building everything down. Probably the seeds for that, no pun intended, are longer. I'm going to let you get back to where you were, but it might be tricky given my long digression. But I'm just going to, maybe if you want to just kind of go back to some of the roots in Afghanistan and Iraq for some of the weakness we've portrayed, or you can pursue, I guess, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, how that was precipitated. What are the kind of the smells of war that you see out on the horizon?
Yeah, Afghanistan. I spent 2 years in Afghanistan. I spent 2 years in Iraq. So 4 years between those wars. And by the way, there's a difference between war correspondence and combat correspondence and military journalists or correspondents, right? They might seem subtle, but like military correspondents might be somebody that's lives in Tampa and covers like MacDill Air Force Base, right? Never really goes to war or something, but covers like, hey, we got a new CENTCOM commander, that sort of thing, right? We got a new jet, and something like along those lines. War correspondents, most of the war correspondents that I know do very little, if any, combat at all. The vast majority do no combat. They'll go to in the Vietnam War, they would be in Saigon, right? Or in the Iraq War, they would be in the Green Zone in Baghdad, right? Or in Afghanistan, they would mostly be in Kabul, right? And then there's a very small number that are combat correspondents who do combat. And when it came to combat, nobody did it like I did it in Iraq or
That's
Afghanistan,
literally true.
according to according to the New York Times, anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe you could just give a few, no pun intended, crystals from your time there. I guess that's kind of obliquely referring to General or Stanley McChrystal. But what are the things that you noticed going on in either of those wars? How were they? I guess the word prosecuted. What changed? What were the political directives? How well were they run? What was successful? What wasn't? And what was your kind of overall feeling about the way the wars percolated?
I left Afghanistan in 2011, and I never went back. And the reason why I left was because I was like, this, it wasn't worth risking my life anymore. It's clear that we weren't going to win. In fact, I started publishing in 2006, way ahead of the curve, that we're losing the war in Afghanistan. I was very unpopular in 2006. It wasn't until about 2009 that mainstream media started to catch up. And and for many reasons. You got to keep in mind, I spend most of my life downrange. I spend most of my life in places like Nepal or India or third world countries or running around China, that sort of thing. So, so when I look at Afghanistan, I look at it through the eyes of somebody who's constantly in countries like that, right? And I can see that. Like, let's go back to Nepal. Nepal started to really open up. I spent a year in Nepal. I was out with the Maoists during their war, that sort of thing. And during the since about the 1950s when Nepal started to open up, they're still one of the poorest countries in the world, right? And they
Hmm.
have a similar problem set that Afghanistan has. I've been all over Afghanistan, spent a year in Nepal, and I spent 2 years in Afghanistan. The problem set is quite similar insofar as they've got huge amounts of mountains and terrains with no roads, almost no infrastructure, lack of bridges, huge amounts of cultures, many different cultures. Now, people who haven't been around Afghanistan much might go, well, there's just Pashtun and Tajiks and Hazars or something. It's a lot more nuanced than that. It's like fish on the coral reef. There's a lot of different sorts of people. There, a lot of the things that I used to take for granted when I grew up in Winter Haven, Florida,
Hmm.
city of 100 lakes, is all these little bridges we have, right? You take those little bridges for granted when you grow up in a place like the United States and the infrastructure was already built by the time I was born. I thought everybody has bridges everywhere, right? We only needed little bridges, but in Winter Haven, Florida. But if you're in a place like Nepal or Afghanistan, the lack of these little bridges is a big, big deal, right? And another problem that they have in almost every country I go to is most people cannot self-organize. I mean, for instance, if you were one village leader and I was another, and there was a river between us, and we needed a bridge to do trade and to do this, that, and the other, we would like schedule a picnic one day and say, I'd be like, hey, Randy, let's get together and let's have a picnic. And hey, you know what? It'd be good if we had a bridge, wouldn't it? And you got a bunch of trees and I got a bunch of men, and I know this other guy in the other village that knows how to build bridges. We would somehow get a bridge built, and we wouldn't wait for somebody to do it. But if you go to a place like Nepal, you go to a place like Afghanistan, these little tiny bridges that would be easy for people like us to build, even if they were rickety bridges, we would have a bridge built. And they just won't do it. They won't self-organize, right? And so they'll be like that forever. So basically, all these little valleys and mountains all over Afghanistan or Nepal, they're just like different little planets. You know what I mean? I mean, they're just like they'll never come together. And for instance, in Afghanistan, about 80% of the people live in about 8 cities, right? It's very similar in Nepal, but fewer cities like Kathmandu, Pokhara, and a couple more, right? So most of the people live in just a few little places, and then everybody else is out in the boondocks, and I mean proper boondocks, right? And so when I was out there running around Afghanistan, I'm like, yeah, I was having lunch with Joe McCaffrey one time in Washington. I flew back. I said, Barry, it was just me and him. I said, you know what? I saw you on, I don't know, MSNBC or whatever he was a consultant for. And you're very bravely saying this is going to take like 15 years or something. I'm like, it ain't going to take 15 years, sir. We're talking like a century. I mean, because, I know it's unpopular to say 15 years because Americans want to hear, we'll be done in 5 years and we'll be out of there. It's like, no, sir, Bob. Look, Nepal opened up in about 1950, and 60, 70 years later, they're still one of the poorest countries on earth, right? And so it's just not going to happen that fast, period, right? And so you just think about the problem set. First of all, almost nobody in Afghanistan speaks access languages like English or French or Russian or
Hmm.
Chinese or Japanese. They speak Pashtun or Tajik, right? They speak Farsi. Some of them speak Farsi, which is an access language, actually. When I say access language, I
No, I
mean
understand.
a language with which you can, yeah, you know what I mean. But a lot of people might not. Access languages is like, one of the superhighways to education. It needs to be something like Russian or French or German or English, right?
All right, so let me ask you a
Japanese,
side question
Chinese,
about that.
Arabic.
I apologize for interrupting, but you're bringing up an interesting point. You brought up the, I think, the Belt and Road Initiative, China. Um, is the Belt and Road going to go through, say, Afghanistan or Nepal? And I also, just a side note, you're talking about kind of this kind of forced, I guess, what would you call it? Kind of aggressive migration techniques. I think that Tibet has been,
Weaponized.
yeah, weaponized migration. I think China did that. Han Chinese did that to Nepal, and um, and I think they're also doing it to the
Tibet.
Uyghur
Yep.
region. What is that, Xinjiang, or forget the name of it? I think they're doing
Xinjiang. Yeah.
to those places as well. At any rate, so I think that's part of a sweep. It's kind of a colonial sweep, and one man's colonialism, bad colonialism, is another man's economic stimulation. I mean, the British colonized a good fraction of the world at a given point, but as a residuum, the British speaking places are more on the economic highway historically, and have done better than places that weren't colonized by them or colonized by other countries. So a lot of times it's a matter of by whom you're going to be colonized. And are the Chinese, to give them their credit, they've spent an enormous amount of money on this, and it's probably self-serving, no doubt. But this kind of recreation of part of the old Silk Road are some of these, kind of hard to get places, the various stands and whatnot, Tajik, Kazakh, Turkmen, and all that kind of stands. So are they going to be benefiting from this? And along with the kind of seem like new accord between Russia and China. So a lot of these places, I mean, that can be accelerated. I mean, if they've been out of the way places, they're not necessarily all out of the way when they're not out of the way anymore, when they're in the way.
Yeah. I mean, I've been up to Tibet, and clearly that's a genocide. You'll see Tibetans living in, well, a lot of them are in northern India, right? Like in Dharamsala and that sort of area. I've been up there actually to the residence of Dalai Lama, and where is he living at? I've been up there. It's been years ago though. But also, and there's many that are in Nepal. I've seen a lot of Tibetans in Hong Kong actually, and many places like the United States. Anyway, they're also doing similar to the Uyghurs, of course, more hard genocide, Mongolians, and a soft, very soft genocide with the Hong Kongers. Genocide is how Han Chinese roll, right? I mean, that's just they'll do a genocide in a New York minute. That's just how they do it. They clear the fields. And so, I mean, they've done it to themselves. Look at Mao's Great Famine. There's a great book called Mao's Great Famine,
Well,
actually.
it's interesting when
That
you say
maybe,
do it to themselves. I mean, that is a a sui genocide or genocide is an interesting proposition. The one child policy, which I guess is only now softening a little bit, and it might already have been too kind of inured, kind of built into the system that people are not propagating. So they have their own. The one child system led to having just boy children, boy babies, because they were going to kind of uniquely provide and whatnot, and the girls would go off to somebody else's family. So kind of this, self-preservatory aspect had them, as long as they're going to only have one child, make it a boy child. So there's a huge, kind of like the snake eating a mouse. There's this huge gulp of weird demographics. I think you can maybe speak to this a little better than I can, of like male predominance of guys who are not going to necessarily be able to marry and whatnot. It's going to be a secondary drain on the Chinese. And at some point, won't they need their own in-migration? Won't they need their own Mexico or whatever to provide the youth that they are presumably absent of, given their previous one-child policy? So do they have their own internal fractures and so forth? Again, my son's podcast, The Synopsis, which I get a lot of my information of this sort from, points this out, that they are reaching some danger stage where they don't have enough people to do the things they need to do.
they do. And I mean, they snag women for wives, that, and basically kidnap, not basically, I mean, and buy them or kidnap them, right? But actually, the self genocide wasn't just massive abortion and selected abortion. It was also the famine. It's estimated 50 million Chinese killed by Chinese, 50 million, if that number's accurate. with Mao's Great Famine, which was another internal replacement strategy, right? In fact, Mao, he was not like he loved Stalin. I don't know if he loved him. I mean, a little friction there, but let's say he followed his leads, right? And when Mao did that, when Stalin did famines across the Soviet Union, wiping out kulaks and that sort of thing, Mao picked him up on it and supersized it to Chinese proportion, as if Stalin didn't already do a pretty good job himself. I mean, these guys like Mao, he made Hitler look like an amateur. I mean, that guy was full on, and they worship him. I've been to Beijing at the Forbidden City, and you wait for hours to go see Mao under glass, right? They worship that guy like he's a god or something. I don't know if that thing that I saw was actually Mao or just some sort of stuffed thing or something, but it's amazing how much they worship him. And speaking of which, you'll see Chinese the Hong Kongers called the Han Chinese, they call them Chai Nazis. And the reason they call them Chai Nazis, remember, Nazism is fascism with a huge racial component, right?
Mhm.
I'm not saying fascism as in, it has to be Italian. I mean, fascism is, of course, when the government and business so conjoin and co-sanguinate that
Mhm.
they are indistinguishable. The industry, like, all the huge business people and the government as no longer distinguishable. That's fascism, right?
Mhm.
Now just add a huge racial component to that, and you got Nazism, right? And so and that's why the Hong Kongers, and they got signs all over Hong Kong, China. Well, they used to, and of course, not since 2020. But they had signs all over Hong Kong, China Nazis. And when I first got there, well, I'd been there years before, but when I got there in June of 2019, because I could see that they were going into a real resistance. So I flew back and spent 7 months with them until I got kicked out. But they had China Nazi signs all over Hong Kong. And I asked them, why do you call them China Nazis? And they're like, aren't you paying attention? You've never seen anybody more racist in your whole world. They want to wipe out us because we're, Cantonese speaking Hong Kongers. They don't even look. I know for the rest of the world, they probably look the same. But even to me, who spends most of my life overseas and much of that time in Asia, in 25 different countries just in Asia, they look very different to me, right?
Mhm.
First of all, the Hong Kongers are shorter, their bones are different. They just look different, and they look different to the Han Chinese tend to be much bigger, and they really look down on the Cantonese speaking Hong Kongers, and they do want to wipe them out, and they're working on it. Right. For instance, they're doing mostly a soft genocide by getting the Hong Kong children to go to school in places like Beijing, right? You see the same in Panama. There's a Confucius Institute right downtown in Panama City at the university, right? I've been down there. And I was one of the first in the United States to start ringing the bell about the Confucius Institutes around the United States and Canada. In 2014, if you look up my name in Confucius Institutes, you'll see me starting to warn about Confucius Institutes at places like Harvard, right? What they'll do, how the Confucius Institutes work, is they'll come in and they'll offer the university, a bunch of money. Hey, we'll start a Mandarin language program for you, and we'll provide the textbooks and everything, and we'll give you $200,000 a year or whatever for your university. So you need to have a Mandarin program to draw the top students and that sort of thing. What they're doing is they're coming in to select and recruit students. So they'll end up getting scholarship offers to go the students to go study in China, and that's where they recruit the students of the elite families and that sort of thing. There's actually a really interesting counter intelligence short film by the FBI and the counterintelligence department. You can see it's called Game of Pawns, I think, right? Game of Pawns. And you should look it up. I've published it many times, but I haven't done it in the last couple of years. But all American students who are taking, I was talking with one of my family members actually, and I was asking her what she's a niece of mine. I said, what are you studying? She said Chinese. I said, oh, Chinese. Uh, really? Have you been offered a scholarship to China? And she go, oh, how did you know? And I said, oh, Well, that's interesting. That's so. And anyway, my niece is not going to China for, you know what I mean. I was like, that they're trying to recruit you to be a spy. That's what they do. And if you look at this FBI counterintelligence short film, it's about an American student who was brought over to. It's a true story. Who was brought over to China? He's, you know, gifted in languages. He wanted to study language. So what they'll do is they'll get you to write papers. The Chinese will, and like, hey, write papers about what you think of China, and they'll start to form your ideas. And the next thing you know, they were trying to recruit this kid to get a job at the U.S. State Department. He failed the test because, you know, working for the for that, that's a harder test actually. So his handler said, why don't you try to get a job at the CIA, right? Which is a much easier test. And so he's like, okay. And so he took the test at the CIA, he passed the test, right? And so now he's going for his polygraph down in Virginia, and he got arrested, right? And he had already been paid. They had been paying him a bunch of money. The kid used it, that gave it to his father to pay off his house. He went to prison. So when the kid was in prison, he helped make this film for the FBI. Counter again, it's called, I think, Game of Pawns. It's really worth watching, actually, especially if you have young people in your family who have been offered scholarships to go study in China. Don't let them do it. I
Mm.
mean, that's a huge,
Well,
that's a
you know,
draw.
I think one of my from my alma mater, Yale. There's some guy, I can't remember his name. He's the son of the president. It sounds like hunter gatherer. Just kidding. Actually, to be honest with you, I've had some posts taken down on Facebook because they bring up Hunter Biden, even years after the fact. Um,
Yeah.
and so the question is whether on some level, whether the best investments. I had a friend who, for long periods of time, said local government is your best corruption dollar value. So he always recommended, if you own property someplace, to go to all the local times that a political candidate would have, be generous and all that kind of stuff. And then you get the permitting you want and this and that, and you can kind of circumvent a lot of the rules. And his feeling was local government was a place to play your money. But I kind of feel as if federal government has been a huger value. In a sense, when you look back, the paltry amounts, even though they're millions that were given to Hunter Biden, have paid off incredibly, because of course they didn't stay merely with Hunter Biden, and whether China already has an offense in a sense hacked our system, and whether it's distinguishable whether we could figure out the edicts and mandates that our current president has done by letting the border open for for the entire world, including kind of a Chinese potential professional / espionage onslaught, and for whomever else has decided to make this pathway, and the money from Ukraine. So these two things kind of, I think they are mirror, but very similar aspects. We're spending a lot of our money and potentially at some point our personnel in Ukraine. And I think overextended. I mean, you can see that we have a huge inflation. We're printing money to kind of fuel this. That's borrowing from ourselves and borrowing from our own assets and so forth. And whether, at this point, we've villainized Russia, which, let's be frank, was not our friend, but was it more or less dangerous than China, who's playing the longer game? We've thrown Russia into the lap of China, and we've made a new consolidation there. Are we going to be bitten by this? And are we, basically dropping Taiwan as the next part by having saved, quote unquote, saved Ukraine, and in part turning into a scarred battlefield? Are we going to lose Taiwan because we are overextended or we accede to Chinese demands, or China has gotten too powerful in the meanwhile?
Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. The Ukraine war is the biggest mistake since, I don't know, since maybe the last 100 years. This is a massive error, and a lot of people can't quite see this. Or is it a massive error? If you're trying to drive the world into global famine, not the entire world will starve to death, it won't. But if you're trying to drive these human osmotic pressures, the push and the pull of migration to collapse EU countries like France and Netherlands and and so many others, or the United States. I spend a lot of time down on our borders, whether it's in Colombia, Panama, Mexico, Texas, Arizona, or in Europe, on the border with Greece and Turkey and Lithuania and Belarus. I'm out there all the time watching these flows, right? And I'm watching what's happening with the food issues. For instance, at the BASF chemical plant at Ludwigshafen, Germany, a huge producer of nitrogenous fertilizers, about 2 weeks ago, announced that they're letting off another 2,600 people who happen to work at one of their two ammonia plants. This is a big deal for the farmers out there who are paying attention. You know what I mean? The nitrogenous fertilizer prices have gone through the roof. I mean, they're just this is a big deal. For instance, Brazil gets most of their nitrogenous fertilizers from Europe, and Europe doesn't have enough to export now. We get a huge amount of our protein from Brazil. I was talking with a Dutch pig farmer a few weeks ago over in the Netherlands, and we were talking about he has about 1,030 pigs, I think it was, something like about 1,000, let's say. And he has Christmas trees and pear trees, right? Which interesting mix. Pigs, pear trees, and Christmas trees. And he said, it was a very smart. Farmers tend to be smart people, and because especially these ones who have done it for intergenerationally, they wouldn't be able to keep the farm. Stupid people don't keep the farm. You know what I mean?
Right.
You have to have certain behavior patterns that have these farms passed down century after century in the same family, as it is in Netherlands, and the fishermen as well. And he was very proud that he had, he said, well, I asked him how much his nitrogenous fertilizers were costing. And he said, oh, I don't have any because I take the pig manure and that's how I fertilize my trees. And I said, well, that's not really, where do you get your pig feed? And he said, Brazil. And he's a smart guy. It dawned on him without me saying another word, right? He's like, yeah, long pregnant pause. Brazil. Brazil gets their nitrogenous fertilizers from mostly Europe. And I said, what's happening to your feed prices for your pigs? He's like, yeah, you're right. It's going. I didn't even need to fill in the blanks for him. He's a smart guy. He doesn't have the circle of Lion King. It's the circle of life. It's the circle of life that also leaves, Germany and goes off to Brazil and with the nitrogenous fertilizers makes the maize and the other pig feeds that he needs, and then comes on a ship right back to him.
Right.
So it's I was over in Ireland talking with. I'll close on this, but I was over in Ireland talking with Mary Lou McDonald. She's the leader of Sinn Féin, right, which is a Che worshiping organization, to put it mildly. And all she wanted to talk. I was with her in a bar. I don't drink, but it's Ireland, so she's doing her Mary Lou thing in the bar. Everybody knows Mary Lou. Oh, Mary Lou, Mary Lou. You walk down the street with her, everybody, she's a superstar, right? And everybody thinks she'll end up being the prime minister of Ireland when they think that Northern Ireland is going to, bond again with the Republic of Ireland, which I'm like, I don't know. Maybe it will. Who knows? Whatever. There's still a huge wall in Belfast. Have you been to that? This is a massive wall. It's bigger than the Trump wall on the border with Mexico. Let's put like a lot bigger. You would have to be a professional baseball player to lug a baseball over that wall. It's like that's how big it is between the Catholics and the Protestants, and they still think that they're going to be able to. Anyway, so I'm talking with Mary Lou, right, and we're in this bar, and it's Ireland, so everybody's getting drunk, and I don't drink, so I'm like, here we go. So I said, Mary Lou, what about the food issues? She's like, oh, we produce enough food for 25 million people. That's what all the Irish say. We produce enough food. That's like a talking point. And we have fewer than 8 million people on the island. I'm like, okay, true. However, that's not the real balance sheet on this. You import your energy and your fertilizers, and those are in increasingly short supply, and the prices are going through the roof. She's like, oh, what my policies are all about equity and inclusion and all that. I'm like, this place is going to have another famine, right? I mean, seriously, it's run by idiots. I mean, Mary Lou McDonald has an IQ like Hunter Biden level, right? And yet she's super popular over there. And that's what I see around the world. Most of the leaders I'm out with in various countries now with with a member of parliament here in member of the diet. They call it the diet here in Japan that I was with this morning. He got it. He understood it. I was with him in his office this morning. Then I jumped on the bullet train and came up here. But he totally gets it. He realizes that Japan imports 80 to 90% of its food. They've got serious problems on energy, and they're easily cut off. And most of their nuclear plants are still not open. And bottom line is, Japan is highly vulnerable in a war
Right.
with China.
Right. Well, I
mean,
think
the
it's
only
not
way back
necessarily going to be a
then.
war. I think it's going to be like getting back to pear trees. I think it's going to be just a ripe fruit that drops into their hands. Ditto Taiwan, once they encircle and so forth. I'm not sure we have the ability to puncture an encirclement, and nor necessarily the political will to do that, to overextend on both fronts. And whatnot. And getting just back to Ukraine, Ukraine is basically the Nebraska.
Randy, our Navy can't sail around without running into each other.
Right.
I mean, they crash their ships into
Right.
stuff,
So
like hitting the coral and hitting the
there's
other ship.
so many points to bring up. I have a contact who was telling me that the military is not necessarily looking for kind of the warrior types anymore, because so many things have been offloaded to drones and kind of like computerized functions. Well, a lot of our intel is computer chatter and so forth, and where they're not necessarily looking for intrepid warriors, and a lot of the backbone, the kind of emotional backbone of the military is gone. And then on top of it, all this DEI kind of stuff, which may translate ultimately to DIE. We don't necessarily have, we're kind of ghosting or kind of emptying out. Kind of like there's a tree nearby that looked great. It just fell the other day, and you look in it, it's all been hollowed out. The termites or whatever have been through it, and it looked like a tree for a long time and stood there for a long time, but it just boom, it just fell. I kind of feel like some of our institutions are going through that as well. And a lot of these things are echoing, the Dutch farmers not being able to, be Dutch farmers, not being able to farm because of, kind of environmental stuff, Greta Thunberg stuff. And so they can't use nitrates. They can't do this. Ukraine has been taken off the table. It's basically the Great Plains of that part of the world and feeding a large part of Africa. I mean, I think you're bringing up interesting topics, which I don't think people consider all the time. You call it as food insecurity, but I think it's just basically insecurity at security. And for all the people who said, "Oh,
It's
Trump's
not
going
food
to,"
insecurity per se. Let me clarify. I'm not saying it's food insecurity. This is clearly manufactured. This is clearly like Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2.
right?
When those were, I was in BASF last year. I was there twice. And at one point, I was there with Masako Ganaha, the Japanese journalist who tracked down Klaus Schwab and went viral, a few months ago, right?
Yeah, I remember
I was
that.
there at BASF with her. And I asked inside the plant, and Masako was running audio or video or something. And I asked the guy, what will happen to BASF? Because we were specifically there on nitrogen issues, on ammonia production for nitrogenous fertilizers. So I asked him, what will happen if Nord Stream is cut? This is before it was cut,
Right.
because I could sense something was coming, right? And he's like, well, then that's it. He said something like, Masako's got it on video or audio. It was something like, he said something well, then BASF is dead or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not dead yet, but it's clearly like decrease. It's clearly shrinking, and
Right.
it's sending operations to China and the United. This is a big deal when these
Huge.
nitrogenous fertilizer productions are
Huge. I
greatly
mean, we don't
impacted.
realize all the things that we use that are chemically derived. We'd like to run everything on fairy dust, but it doesn't seem to make constructive things. So we're rounding out the hour. I want to close by giving you a couple minutes to capsulize things. I'm going to let people see where they can get in touch with you, maybe help support you, and so forth. So I'm going to put up, just a background, maybe a couple pages of yours. And why don't you tell us a little bit about what your plans are now and how people can support you and find you?
Since 2005, I've been reader supported by donations, actually, since 2005. So I'm on Twitter every day, Michael underscore Jan, and I'm on Locals almost every day. The last day or so, I didn't actually publish on Locals because of so many meetings and that sort of thing. But normally I'm on Locals every single day. And but the reason I'm reader supported is because nobody owns me. Because
Mhm,
if you nobody can cut me off,
mhm,
right? And Wikipedia. Oh, I don't know if it's accurate there because sometimes they attack me on Wikipedia, and I
mhm.
don't have time to check it all the time. But Wiki, what I study information war. By the way, I've written 6 books. 3 are on information war. Those 3 on information war, unfortunately, are only in Japanese. They're not even in English. And it's interesting because one of the main things I talk about in one of the books is Wikipedia. There's the China Nazi thing on my Hong Kong, or that I made that photo in Hong Kong. That's in Hong Kong. Oh, so many. The police used to just beat those young people down right in front of me. Unbelievable. But hmm, yeah. And those are good people. I would take 100,000 Hong Kongers tomorrow. They're mostly family people. They work hard. They're highly intelligent. They don't do much crime. You know what I mean? They would be an addition to the United States, but CCP has absorbed them. Mostly. There are actually a lot that did make it out, but anyway. But bottom line is there's a lot going on, and there's a lot of moving parts to this. Food security, the World Economic Forum has been crystal clear that they want to reduce the world population of 500 million. It's very clear that they're going to reduce it some amount. I don't know how much. And World Economic Forum and Chinese Communist Party are just completely entwined. They share the same heartbeat. Now, eventually, they're clearly going to fight each other. That's obvious to me because I watch them both day in and day out. But right now, they have a lot of intermediate goals that coincide. The Venn diagram is overlapping a lot right now. For instance, both the World Economic Forum and CCP would like to take control of Netherlands. So you can see that they are working in collusion to do that. Eventually, or say the Panama Canal. Chinese Communist Party is making a very big go for Panama, right? Now, the World Economic Forum obviously doesn't want TCP to have Panama, right? I mean, they're going to be competing on some things, and other things they reinforce. But keep in mind, every year there's the annual meeting in Davos. There's also annual meetings in China. And this isn't hidden. This is right on their website. It's right in the open. But most people don't realize that the World Economic Forum and China are even top Chinese people I'm sorry, Japanese government people that I talk with. Most of them don't realize how close that relationship
Yeah.
actually is between Chinese Communist Party and the World Economic Forum.
All right. So I'm going to call it there. Um, we've got so many other things to get to. Maybe we'll have you back on and talk about some of them. I'm in your debt. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to bring up my own personal uh, um, my own personal self-promotion here, which is see if I can put. They've changed the outlook. Here we go. This is my own book here. You can help support me by buying this book. You don't have to read it. No, I'm just kidding. You should read it. It's Overturning Zika, the pandemic that never was. Here's a picture of the cover. It's got my portrait here. It's a kind of I don't think I was smiling for this picture, so I apologize. But it's about the pandemic, Zika pandemic in Brazil. Zika microcephaly causation. Zika exists. Zika is a real virus, but it does not cause microcephaly. That's kind of my point. Anyway, I'd like you to go check it out if you can. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much, Michael, for being on my show. And you can hang on for talk for a little bit. But we're going to say goodbye to everybody else.